The first time I thought my wife was cheating on me, it was because of a grocery receipt. Not perfume, not lipstick, not a late-night text, a grocery receipt. Emily had gone shopping on a Wednesday evening, just like she always did. When she came home, she unpacked everything onto the kitchen counter while I finished answering emails from work. Milk, bread, chicken, vegetables, coffee. Everything looked normal. Later that night, while taking the trash outside, I noticed the receipt sticking out of the bag. I wasn't trying to snoop. I only picked it up because I wanted to check if she'd remembered to buy coffee. She had. But something else caught my eye. 2 prepared meals. 1 bottle of sugar-free nutritional shake. Adult disposable gloves. None of those things were in our kitchen. I checked every grocery bag again. Nothing. The receipt clearly showed she had paid for them. But they had disappeared before she came home. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe she'd bought something for a coworker. Maybe she'd forgotten a bag in the car. Before leaving for work the next morning, I checked the trunk. Empty. I didn't mention it. Because after 11 years of marriage, you don't interrogate your wife over groceries. At least, that's what I believed. My name is Michael Turner. I'm 42 years old, and I work as a financial auditor. My entire career revolves around finding small inconsistencies, numbers that don't match, expenses that don't make sense, tiny details everyone else ignores. Most of the time, that habit stays at the office, but once you notice something, it's almost impossible to stop. A week later, another receipt appeared. This one was from a pharmacy. Vitamin supplements, medical tape, skin moisturizer for radiation burns, another box of disposable gloves. Again, none of it was in our house. This time I looked through the entire car. Nothing. When Emily came inside carrying the last grocery bag, I casually asked, "Did you stop anywhere else today?" She smiled without hesitation. "Just the grocery store." That answer sat with me all evening, because technically, it wasn't true. The pharmacy receipt was sitting in the trash. She had stopped somewhere else, and she hadn't mentioned it. I wanted to believe she'd simply forgotten. Instead, I started paying attention. It wasn't something I was proud of. Every Thursday evening, Emily left the house around 6. She always had a reasonable explanation. Helping a coworker, meeting an old friend, working late, picking something up. Every excuse sounded possible. None of them sounded specific. Then I noticed something else. Every Thursday, her phone location disappeared. Not permanently, only for 3 or 4 hours. Around 10 o'clock, it would magically return. Exactly where it should be. Home. The first time I checked, I laughed at myself. Who even looks at their spouse's location history? Apparently, someone who was looking for reasons not to trust the person he loved most. I hated what I was becoming. Emily had never lied about anything important. She'd never hidden money. Never hidden her phone. Never acted distant. If anything, she had become kinder over the last few months. She still kissed me goodbye every morning. Still texted me to ask how my day was going. Still planned weekend trips. Still reached for my hand whenever we watched television together. Nothing about our marriage felt broken, which somehow made the small lies feel even bigger. One evening I came home earlier than usual. Emily didn't hear me walk inside. She was sitting at the dining room table with several envelopes spread out in front of her. Cash. More cash. She was counting $100 bills. Nearly $2,000. The moment she heard the front door close, she quickly gathered everything into an envelope. "Oh, you're home early." "Yeah." I looked at the envelope. "Everything okay?" She smiled. "Just paying a few things." "What things?" She hesitated. "Some personal stuff." Personal. It wasn't like her. We had always shared everything. Joint accounts, joint savings, joint decisions. Money had never been something we hid from each other. That night, after she fell asleep, I quietly opened our online banking. Nothing unusual. No missing transfers. No large withdrawals. Then I checked the ATM history. Every Thursday afternoon, $300. Cash. Always from the same ATM. Always an hour before she disappeared. The pattern went back almost 3 months. Over $3,000. Gone. In cash. No explanation. The next morning I asked as casually as I could, "Have we had any unexpected expenses lately?" Emily looked up from her coffee. "Not really. I was thinking maybe we should review the budget." She smiled. "You're the auditor. I trust you." Those words should have made me feel better. Instead, they made me feel worse, because I wasn't sure I deserved that trust anymore. Over the following 2 weeks, I promised myself I'd stop looking. No more checking receipts, no more bank statements, no more wondering where she went every Thursday. Then Saturday arrived. Emily was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I wasn't planning to touch it. Then it buzzed again. The screen lit up. No name, only a phone number. The preview read, "Thursday will be harder than usual. Thank you for not giving up on her." Her. Not him. Not us. Her. Before I could process that, another message appeared. "She asked if you'd be coming again next week." The phone went dark. A minute later, Emily walked into the kitchen drying her hair with a towel. She smiled. "Who's texting?" I looked at her for a second longer than I should have. I didn't check. That wasn't completely true. I hadn't opened the conversation. But I'd seen enough. That night, I barely slept. Every explanation fought with another. Maybe her was a patient. Maybe it was someone's mother. Maybe Emily was volunteering somewhere. Or maybe her was exactly the kind of message someone sends when they know another person's spouse might accidentally see the screen. Once doubt gets into your mind, it becomes incredibly creative. And for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I seriously wondered whether I actually knew where my wife spent her Thursday nights. I told myself I wasn't going to follow her, not because I didn't want answers, because I wasn't sure our marriage could survive the kind of man I'd become if I did. For the next 2 Thursdays, I stayed home. Emily left a little after 6. She kissed me goodbye, told me not to wait up, and drove away. I never asked where she was going. She never volunteered the information. Instead, I sat in the living room pretending to watch television while constantly checking the clock. 6:30, 7:15, 8, 9. At exactly 9:58 p.m., I heard her car pull into the driveway, almost every time. The schedule was so precise, it almost felt rehearsed. She always came home tired, sometimes emotionally drained, but never guilty, never nervous. She'd ask how my evening had been, tell me she loved me, then fall asleep almost the moment her head touched the pillow. That was the part I couldn't understand. Everything people say to watch for, she wasn't doing. She wasn't protective of her phone. She didn't hide text messages. She never suddenly worked late on random days. It was always Thursday. Always 6 until 10. Always the same. Then another small detail caught my attention. Every Friday morning, Emily looked exhausted. Not sleepy. Exhausted. Like someone who hadn't been carrying boxes, but emotions. She'd sit quietly at the breakfast table, staring into her coffee before leaving for work. One Friday, I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You okay?" She smiled. "Just a long week." "You've been saying that every Friday." She laughed softly. "I guess Thursdays are catching up with me." There it was again. Thursday. She'd mentioned it without realizing. "What happens on Thursdays?" I asked as casually as I could. She froze, only for a second, then she smiled again. "Oh, just everything." She changed the subject immediately. Asked about one of my clients. Started talking about weekend plans. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. She had answered without answering. A few days later, I was balancing our monthly budget when another inconsistency appeared. Emily had donated $500, cashier's check, no recipient listed in our online banking. That wasn't unusual by itself. Emily had always been generous. She regularly donated to charities, animal shelters, food banks, children's hospitals. The strange part was she'd never mentioned this one. The memo line simply read, "RCF, nothing else." I searched our records. The exact same payment appeared the previous month, and the month before that. $500, every 4 weeks, always to RCF. I searched online. Nothing obvious came up. No charity with those initials nearby. No organization we had ever supported before. When Emily came home that evening, I asked, "Have you started supporting a new charity?" She looked surprised. "What makes you ask?" I noticed one of the checks. "Oh." She nodded. "Yeah, It's something important. What kind of charity? She hesitated. I'll tell you someday. Someday. Not today. She kissed me on the forehead and walked upstairs to change. I sat alone at the kitchen table. That single word echoed in my head. Someday. People don't usually postpone conversations like that unless they believe the truth will change something. By the following Thursday, I had convinced myself I needed answers. Not because I wanted to catch her doing something wrong, because the uncertainty was quietly destroying me. At 6:15, Emily grabbed her canvas bag. I'll probably be home around 10. Okay, she smiled. I love you. I love you too. She walked out the front door. I counted to 30, then I picked up my keys. For the first time in our marriage, I followed my wife. I stayed 3 or 4 cars behind her, far enough that she'd never recognize my truck. She drove across town, past the hospital where she worked, past downtown, past the shopping district. Eventually, she entered an older neighborhood filled with brick buildings that had probably stood there for 50 years. She turned into a small parking lot beside a quiet one-story building. No large sign, no business name, only a small brass plaque near the entrance. She parked, picked up her canvas bag, walked inside. I parked across the street beneath a large oak tree. 5 minutes later, an older man arrived carrying 2 grocery bags. He smiled when he saw Emily. She smiled back. Then he hugged her. Not quickly, not romantically. It looked like the kind of hug people share after surviving something difficult together. The front door closed behind them. I waited. 20 minutes. 40. An hour. Nobody came out. The building remained almost completely silent. No visitors. No deliveries. No employees. Just drawn curtains and a single porch light. I was about to leave when the front door opened again. A little girl stepped outside. She couldn't have been older than 12. She looked toward the parking lot, then smiled and waved enthusiastically. Not at me, at Emily. Emily waved back. And for just a second, I saw an expression on my wife's face I'd never seen before. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't sadness. It was the look of someone trying very hard to stay strong for someone else. Whatever was happening inside that building, it wasn't what I'd convinced myself it was. But I still had no idea what the truth actually was. I drove home before Emily did. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't convinced she was having an affair. But I was even more confused than before. If she wasn't meeting another man, why had she lied? Why disappear every Thursday? Why the cash? Why the secret messages? Why couldn't she simply tell me? She came home at exactly 9:56. The moment she walked through the door, I looked at her differently. Not as someone hiding an affair, as someone carrying a burden. She smiled. You're still awake. I couldn't sleep. She leaned over and kissed me. I'm sorry I'm home late again. I almost asked. Almost. Instead, I forced a smile. Everything okay? She nodded. Yeah. It was just a hard night. Hard. Not busy. Not long. Hard. Then she disappeared upstairs. I sat alone in the dark living room replaying everything I'd seen. The hug. The little girl. The expression on Emily's face. None of it matched the story I'd been telling myself. The next morning I searched the address online. Nothing. No website. No reviews. No staff. Only county property records. Owner. Riverside Community Foundation. That was all. No description. No mission statement. No contact information. It was almost as if the place didn't want to be found. Monday morning I mentioned it to a coworker. Not the whole story, just the name. Ever heard of Riverside Community Foundation? Brian shook his head. No. Sounds like one of those tiny nonprofits. I couldn't find anything. They're probably funded privately. He shrugged. Why? No reason. But there was a reason, and it was slowly consuming me. By Thursday, I was back in the parking lot. This time I parked farther away. Far enough that Emily couldn't possibly recognize my truck. I also brought the binoculars I'd bought years earlier for a camping trip. I hated myself for using them. If Emily ever found out, I wasn't sure she'd forgive me. At 6:17, she arrived. At 6:23, the older man opened the front door. He wasn't alone. A woman in a wheelchair slowly rolled onto the porch. She looked painfully thin, far younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 50s. Emily immediately knelt beside her. She adjusted the woman's blanket, smiled, said something that made the woman laugh, then gently wheeled her back inside. I lowered the binoculars. Nothing about it looked romantic. Nothing. So why keep it secret? Why tell me she was meeting friends? Why hide the messages? I finally admitted something to myself. I no longer believed there was another man, but I still believed there was another life. Around 8:30, another car arrived. Then another. People of every age quietly entered the building carrying grocery bags, flowers, books, puzzles, even homemade food. Nobody stayed longer than an hour. Nobody seemed in a hurry. It looked like people visiting family. Just before 9, an ambulance quietly pulled into the parking lot. No flashing lights, no sirens. 2 paramedics stepped out carrying medical equipment. Emily never came outside. They disappeared into the building. 25 minutes later, the ambulance left. Again, without lights, without sirens. The silence somehow made it worse. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the wheelchair. She hadn't looked frightened. She'd looked comfortable, like she knew everyone there. Like Riverside wasn't a hospital, it was home. Friday morning, Emily stood in the kitchen making pancakes as though nothing unusual had happened. She hummed softly while flipping them in the pan. I watched her longer than I realized. She looked up and smiled. "What?" "Nothing. You've been staring at me all morning." I forced a laugh. "I guess I have." She walked over and wrapped her arms around me. "You know you can tell me if something's bothering you." For a second, I almost confessed everything. That I'd followed her, that I'd searched the building, that I'd watched her through binoculars. Instead, I hugged her back. "I'm just stressed." She nodded. "We both are." Those words hit differently now. Not because she was lying, because she was carrying something I couldn't even see. That afternoon, I made a decision. No more watching from the parking lot. No more guessing. I left work early and drove straight to Riverside. For the first time, I walked to the front door. It was locked. A small brass plaque beside it read, "Riverside Community Foundation. Visitors by appointment only. Nothing more." As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. "Can I help you?" I turned around. It was the older man. Up close, he looked to be around 70. Kind eyes, tired face. He carried 2 grocery bags in one hand. "I'm looking for someone." He studied me for several seconds, then quietly asked, "Emily's husband?" My heart skipped. "You know who I am?" He smiled sadly. "I've seen your picture." "My picture?" He nodded. "Emily keeps one in her bag." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. Almost as if he'd expected this conversation for a long time. "I'm Michael." "I know." He looked toward the building before speaking again. "I've been wondering when you'd finally come." I took a deep breath. "I think my wife has been lying to me." He was silent for several seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. "No. She's been keeping a promise." Before I could ask what he meant, he unlocked the front door. He looked back at me. "If you're ready for the truth, come inside." I followed him through a narrow hallway. The building was much larger than it looked from the outside. Everything was spotless. Quiet. Warm. It didn't feel like an office. It felt like a home. Soft music played somewhere in the distance. The smell of fresh soup drifted through the hallway. On one wall hung dozens of framed photographs. Birthday parties, Christmas dinners, graduations, family reunions. The same faces appeared again and again over the years. People smiled into the camera. Some looked healthy. Others were already sitting in wheelchairs. It wasn't a charity office. It was a place where people lived. The older man noticed me looking. "They're all family here." I frowned. "You mean staff?" He smiled gently. "No, I mean family." We continued walking. Several people greeted him by name. A nurse carrying folded towels smiled as she passed. "Morning, Richard." A volunteer walked by with fresh flowers. An elderly man sitting in a lounge chair waved without saying a word. The atmosphere was peaceful. Not sad, just quiet. Finally, Richard stopped outside a closed room. He rested his hand on the doorknob. I think, before I explain anything, there's someone you should meet. He knocked softly. A weak voice answered from inside. Come in. Richard opened the door. Emily was sitting beside a hospital bed reading from a novel. She looked up. The moment she saw me, the color disappeared from her face. Michael. She stood so quickly that the book slipped from her hands onto the floor. Neither of us moved. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then she whispered, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you. Every single day. Her voice shook. I couldn't. I looked toward the woman lying in the bed. She appeared to be in her early 50s. Very thin. Her hair was gone. An oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. She looked at me with tired but kind eyes. There was something strangely familiar about her face, not because I'd met her before, because she looked so much like Emily. The same eyes, the same smile, just older. Richard quietly closed the door behind us. Then he spoke. Michael, this is Sarah. Emily lowered her head. My sister. The room suddenly felt smaller. I looked back at Emily. You told me you were an only child. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I know. I lied. Those 2 words hurt more than I expected. Not because she'd lied, because I could hear how much she hated saying them. I slowly pulled a chair closer. I don't understand. Emily took a long breath. When I was 19, Sarah disappeared from my life. I frowned. What do you mean? My parents blamed her for something that wasn't her fault. They told everyone they no longer had 2 daughters. I stared at her. They erased her. They sold our house. We moved to another state. They made me promise I'd never contact her again. I looked towards Sarah. She gave me a weak smile. My parents told relatives I had died. I honestly thought I'd misheard her. What? She nodded slowly. It was easier for them. They said it was less embarrassing than admitting they had a daughter who'd become addicted to pain medication. Emily wiped tears from her face. Sarah was in a terrible car accident. She survived, but the pain medication slowly destroyed her life. She lost her marriage, her job, everything. Our parents blamed her instead of the addiction. The room fell silent. I didn't know what to say. Emily looked at me. I wanted to tell you years ago. So many times. But it wasn't my secret anymore. Sarah begged me not to. Richard quietly added, people judge addiction. They judge it even after recovery. Sarah looked toward the window. I spent years believing everyone would be better off without me. Emily reached over and gently took her hand. 3 years ago, Richard called me. He'd been helping Sarah for a long time. When the cancer came back, she finally asked if she could see me again. Cancer. That word hit harder than anything else I'd heard. Everything suddenly started fitting together. The nutrition shakes, the prepared meals, the disposable gloves, the pharmacy receipts, the Thursday nights, the ambulance. Emily hadn't been living a double life. She'd been spending every Thursday saying goodbye to the sister she'd been forced to lose once already. Emily looked at me through tears. I wanted to tell you. So many times. But every time I tried, Sarah asked me not to. I looked at Sarah. She gave me a small, embarrassed smile. I didn't want to be the reason your marriage changed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For nearly 2 months, I'd convinced myself my wife was living a secret life with someone else. The truth was, she'd been protecting someone who had already lost almost everything. Richard quietly excused himself and closed the door behind him. For the first time, the 3 of us were alone. Sarah broke the silence. You're probably wondering why she lied. I nodded. She looked down at her hands. Because I made her promise. Emily squeezed her hand gently. I tried to change your mind. I know. Sarah smiled sadly. You asked almost every week. She turned toward me. Emily wanted you to meet me the first time she came here. I wouldn't let her. Why? She laughed softly. Have you ever spent years believing you're everyone's biggest mistake? I didn't answer. You stop wanting people to know you exist. Emily quietly wiped another tear away. She kept saying she wanted you to remember the version of her from old photographs. Not. She couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah did it for her. Not this. The room fell silent again. After a while, Sarah asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Did you think she was cheating?" I hesitated. Emily answered for me. "He did." Sarah smiled gently. "I don't blame you." Then she looked at Emily. "I told you this would happen." Emily lowered her eyes. "I know. I just couldn't break my promise." I finally asked the question that had haunted me for weeks. "The cash." Emily nodded immediately. "Insurance stopped covering part of Sarah's treatment. So every Thursday, I help pay for medication. The grocery receipts." Emily smiled through tears. "Sarah couldn't keep much food down. The prepared meals were easier. The nutrition shakes helped. And the gloves. Cancer weakens the immune system. Even a small infection can become dangerous." Every strange clue I'd collected suddenly had a perfectly ordinary explanation. One by one, every piece fit. The text messages, the pharmacy, the cash, the missing location, even the old man carrying grocery bags. Nothing had ever pointed toward an affair. Only my own fear had. Emily looked at me carefully. "I know I hurt you. I know I should have trusted you. I couldn't betray her trust after she'd spent half her life believing nobody would choose her." I reached across the bed and took Emily's hand. "I wish you had told me." "So do I. I would have helped." "I know." She started crying again. "That's what makes this so hard. I knew exactly what you would have done. You would have loved her. And she didn't think she deserved that." Over the next hour, Sarah told me stories Emily had never shared. How they used to build blanket forts in the living room. How Emily cried the day Sarah left for college. How the two of them used to ride their bikes until their father whistled for dinner. For the first time, I wasn't meeting the woman lying in the hospital bed. I was meeting Emily's big sister, the person she'd missed for almost half her life. Before I left that evening, Sarah reached into the drawer beside her bed and handed me a folded photograph. Two little girls, covered in mud, holding fishing poles that were almost bigger than they were. Emily laughed the moment she saw it. "Oh no! You kept this?" Sarah grinned. "It's my favorite." I looked at the back. In faded handwriting were 4 simple words. "Best sisters forever." Emily quietly rested her head on Sarah's shoulder. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Watching them together, I realized something that made my stomach twist. For weeks, I'd believed I was watching the beginning of my marriage falling apart. In reality, I had been watching two sisters trying to make up for 15 years they could never get back. 9 days later, Sarah passed away. Emily was holding one of her hands. I was holding the other. In the end, there were no dramatic speeches, no final confession, no movie moment. Sarah simply looked at her sister, smiled, and quietly said, "I'm glad. You weren't alone anymore." Then she closed her eyes. The room became completely still. Emily didn't let go of her hand, not for several minutes. She just sat there, gently rubbing Sarah's fingers as if she could somehow convince herself this wasn't goodbye. Richard quietly switched off the bedside lamp. The nurses entered without saying a word. They had clearly done this many times before, but somehow they still treated every goodbye as if it were the first. On the drive home, neither Emily nor I spoke. There wasn't anything left to say. When we pulled into our driveway, she turned off the engine but didn't move. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me." I looked at her. "I wasn't angry because you had a secret." She stared through the windshield. "I was angry because I thought the secret meant you didn't trust me." She wiped her eyes. "I trusted you more than anyone. Then why carry it alone?" She took a slow breath. "Because Sarah spent 20 years believing she ruined everyone she loved." I couldn't break the first promise she'd asked me to keep after we finally found each other again. I nodded. "I understand that now." She looked at me. "I should have trusted you enough to tell you I couldn't explain. I kept trying to protect both of you. And I almost lost you because of it." I reached across the center console and took her hand. We almost lost each other. A week after the funeral, Emily handed me a small cardboard box. "Sarah wanted you to have this." Inside were dozens of old photographs. Emily and Sarah building snowmen, fishing with their father, riding bicycles through muddy fields, making terrible birthday cakes together. the kind of ordinary memories every family takes for granted. At the bottom of the box sat a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. I unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky, but easy to read. Michael, if you're reading this, it means Emily finally stopped carrying my secret alone. She wanted to tell you long before she actually did. I was the one who kept saying no. I convinced myself I didn't deserve to become part of anyone else's family. Emily never stopped proving me wrong. Please don't let my fear become the reason you stop trusting the best person I've ever known. I had to stop reading. For weeks, I'd been collecting evidence, receipts, ATM withdrawals, late nights, missing hours, hidden messages. Every clue had pointed in one direction. Every conclusion I'd reached had been completely wrong. That night, I apologized to Emily. Not because I'd followed her, not because I doubted her, but because I'd quietly built an entire story in my head before giving her the chance to tell the real one. She smiled through tears. I probably would have done the same. 3 months later, we started volunteering at Riverside together, every Thursday. The same evening, I once believed my wife was meeting someone else. Now we spent those nights serving dinner, reading novels, organizing family photo albums, or simply sitting beside people whose relatives had stopped visiting years earlier. I finally understood why Emily always came home, emotionally exhausted. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person isn't medicine. It's refusing to let them feel forgotten. One Thursday, Richard handed me 2 grocery bags. "Can you put these in room 7? I looked inside. Prepared meals, sugar-free nutritional shakes, disposable gloves. For a second, I just stood there. Those were the same items that had started this entire story. Richard noticed my expression and smiled. Funny how ordinary things can mean completely different things once you know the truth, I smiled back. They changed my life. A year later, Emily and I visited Sarah's grave. We left fresh flowers. Then Emily placed the old photograph of the 2 sisters inside a small waterproof frame beside the headstone. As we walked back to the car, she slipped her hand into mine. "Thank you." "For what?" "For believing me." I laughed quietly. "I didn't. Not at first." She smiled. "No, but you chose to believe me before it was too late." I've thought about that conversation many times since. People always say love is built on trust. They're right. But I've learned something else. Suspicion is easy. Your mind can build an entire story from a handful of missing pieces. Trust is harder. Sometimes it means accepting that the person you love may be carrying a burden they aren't free to explain. Looking back now, I don't remember the receipts, or the text messages, or the Thursday nights. I remember one simple sentence Sarah wrote before she died. "Please don't let my fear become the reason you stop trusting the best person I've ever known." I keep that letter in the drawer beside my bed. Whenever life reminds me how easy it is to jump to conclusions, I read it again. Because the biggest mistake I almost made wasn't believing my wife was having an affair. It was forgetting that sometimes the truth isn't hidden because of betrayal. Sometimes it's hidden because someone made a promise out of love.